The most disturbing detail of this story isn't the brutal murders themselves, but what the killer did afterward. Viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you enjoy mysterious, horrific, and unexplained true events, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And turn on notifications so you don't miss our new videos. Now, let's get started. On a cold morning in early April 1922, a neighbor approached the isolated Hinterkaifeck farmstead in Bavaria, Germany. The Gruber family hadn't been seen for several days, and their 7-year-old daughter, Kazilia, had missed multiple days of school without explanation. As the neighbor drew closer to the farm, an eerie silence hung in the air. No sounds of animals, no human activity, just the unsettling quiet of abandonment. But the farm wasn't abandoned. The cattle were still in their stalls, seemingly well-fed. The dogs were alive. The neighbor called out for Andreas Gruber, the 63-year-old owner of the farm, but received no answer. Growing increasingly concerned, the neighbor gathered a few other locals, and together they began searching the property. What they discovered in the barn would become one of the most disturbing and perplexing murder scenes in German history. Stacked neatly in the hay were the bodies of Andreas Gruber, his wife Kazilia, their 35-year-old widowed daughter Victoria, and her 2-year-old son Joseph. All had been brutally killed with what appeared to be a mattock, a tool similar to a pickaxe. The search continued into the house, where they found the body of the family's new maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had only arrived at the farm the day before the murders. Finally, in her bedroom, they discovered the body of little Kazilia, the 7-year-old granddaughter. The scene was horrific, but what made it even more disturbing were the peculiar details. All 6 victims had been lured to the barn one by one and killed there, except for the maid and the young girl, who were killed in their beds. The killer had covered the bodies with hay after the murders, arranging them almost ceremonially. Most unsettling of all, the medical examiner determined that the family had been killed on Friday evening, March 31st, but today was Tuesday, April 4th. For 4 days, someone had been living on the farm with 6 corpses. The evidence was chilling. Smoke had been seen coming from the chimney throughout the weekend. The cattle and livestock had been fed and tended to daily. Food had been eaten from the kitchen. Neighbors reported seeing smoke from the chimney and even lights moving around the house at night. The killer, or killers, hadn't just committed murder and fled. They had settled in, making themselves at home in a house where 6 people lay dead just yards away. But the strangeness of the Hinterkaifeck case had begun long before the murders themselves. In the days leading up to the killings, Andreas Gruber had mentioned several disturbing occurrences to his neighbors. He had discovered footprints in the fresh snow leading from the edge of the forest directly to the farm. But strangely, there were no footprints leading back. Someone had walked to the farm from the forest and never left, at least not by the same path. Andreas had also told neighbors about hearing footsteps in the attic at night. Keys had gone missing. A strange newspaper, one that no one in the family had purchased, appeared in the house. Small items were disappearing or being moved around. The family had even found unfamiliar scratches around the lock on the tool shed, as if someone had tried to break in. These weren't just the paranoid imaginings of an elderly farmer. Something was wrong at Hinterkaifeck, and Andreas knew it. Perhaps most telling of all was the story of the previous maid. 6 months before the murders, the Gruber's maid had suddenly quit her position and left the farm. When asked why, she claimed that the farmhouse was haunted. She spoke of strange noises, of items moving on their own, of an overwhelming sense that something evil lurked in the house. At the time, her claims were dismissed as superstition. In retrospect, they seemed prophetic. The new maid, Maria Baumgartner, had arrived at Hinterkaifeck on the very day of the murders, March 31st, 1922. She had no connection to the family's troubles, no knowledge of the strange occurrences. She was simply in the wrong place at the worst possible time. Within hours of her arrival, she was dead. A tragic footnote in a case that continues to baffle investigators a century later. The police investigation was extensive for its time. More than 100 suspects were questioned. The murder weapon, believed to be a mattock from the farm itself, was never found. Neither was any significant amount of money. ruling out robbery as a motive. The investigators even brought in psychics and mediums, a common practice in that era, but to no avail. The case grew colder with each passing day. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Hinterkaifeck murders was the methodical, almost ritualistic nature of the killings. The murderer didn't simply burst into the house in a frenzy. Instead, they seem to have lured each victim to the barn individually. Andreas, his wife, their daughter Victoria, and little Joseph were all killed in the barn, one after another, with no signs that any had tried to escape or that they were aware of the previous killings. This suggests either multiple killers or a single killer who was known and trusted by the family. The investigation revealed other disturbing details about the Gruber family. Victoria's 2-year-old son, Joseph, was officially listed as illegitimate. Rumors in the village suggested that Andreas Gruber, Victoria's father, was also the father of her child, the product of an incestuous relationship that had continued for years. These rumors were given credence by the fact that Victoria's husband had died in the First World War years before Joseph was born. Could this dark family secret have been a motive for the killings? Perhaps a vengeful relative or a villager disgusted by the alleged incest. Another theory centered on a neighbor with whom Andreas had a long-standing feud over property lines. The feud had grown so bitter that some believed it could have escalated to violence. But would a property dispute justify the slaughter of an entire family, including children and an innocent maid? Some investigators focused on a more supernatural explanation. The previous maid's claims of hauntings, combined with the strange occurrences before the murders, led some to believe that something otherworldly was involved. While modern investigators dismiss these theories, they were taken quite seriously at the time, especially in the rural, superstitious community where Hinterkaifeck was located. One of the most credible theories involved a man named Carl Gabriel, who was supposedly Victoria's husband and had been reported killed in the war. Some speculated that Gabriel had not actually died, but had deserted, perhaps living in the forest near the farm. Could he have returned to find his wife in an incestuous relationship with her father, with a child as evidence of their sin? The rage and betrayal might have been enough to drive him to murder. Another suspect was a former tenant farmer who had worked the land before the Grubers. He knew the layout of the farm intimately and had reportedly left on bad terms. Could he have harbored enough resentment to return and slaughter the family? A century has passed since the Hinterkaifeck murders, and we are no closer to knowing the truth of what happened on that isolated Bavarian farm. The case files have been lost or destroyed. The physical evidence is long gone. All that remains are the questions, the theories, and the chilling image of a killer moving through a silent house at night. The bodies of his victims lying nearby as he stokes the fire and prepares a meal in their kitchen. Some mysteries are disturbing not just because they remain unsolved, but because they force us to confront the darkness that can exist in the human soul. The Hinterkaifeck murders remind us that sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't supernatural beings or haunted houses. They're the people who might be watching us, waiting, planning, perhaps even living among us undetected. And in the case of Hinterkaifeck, they're the kind of people who can kill an entire family and then sit down at their table for dinner as if nothing had happened at all.